Hello and welcome to a new episode of Other Record Labels. I'm your host, Scott Orr, where we talk about the art and culture of running an independent record label. And today is an interview episode. Before we dive into that, just last week, we had an episode on how to make a record label business plan. And if you haven't yet heard that episode, go back and check it out when you're finished with this week's episode. And we gave away a resource that I put together. It's a template on how to create your own record label business plan. What's really cool is this thing has been downloaded by like 300 to 400, almost 400 people in the past couple of days, which is awesome. And I think hopefully that means we're going to see a bunch of new record labels popping up in the next couple of months, which is also awesome. So if you haven't grabbed that yet and you're interested in it, and I think it's cool because I know our audience varies. Our audience isn't just people hoping or planning to start a record label, but of course are people who have had record labels for a year or more. But what I think is interesting is I think something like this and the exercise of creating an outline and putting together a record label business plan could be helpful for you even if you have a record label already and have been around for a year or 5 years or 10 years. So go to otherrecordlabels.com/business plan to grab that for free. For today's interview, we're crossing over the Atlantic and we're talking with Beth Shalom Records. And what's interesting about my conversation with Joe, the founder today, about their label is they have taken on the arduous objective of becoming a completely carbon neutral record label, which is something I've never heard before. It's very exciting. And it spawned a lot of questions like, what does that mean? What does that look like? And so I hope you enjoy today's interview where we talk about Beth Shalom Records, but we also talk about what it means and how it's possible for some of us with our labels to potentially become carbon neutral. I'm curious, what does the name mean? Can you tell me about that, the history of that?
Yeah, sure. So Beth Shalom Records, it means house of peace in Hebrew. Beth Shalom does.
How to peace?
House of peace.
Oh, house of peace.
Yeah,
okay.
House of peace.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so Beth being house and then peace being shalom. So yeah, basically when I was living at home, that was my parents' house name. And so when I was recording people and stuff like that, and I was just recording people out of my bedroom while at college and school, people were like, oh, what should we put the studio down as? And so I just said, do Beth Shalom Studios.
Yeah.
And then when the label came to be, it just made sense. I've always liked the idea of studios creating in-house labels. So going into have like Beth Shalom Records, it was sort of a very natural transition.
Oh, that's great. So do you still have a studio?
No, I've never really had a studio as such. I've always had sort of a mobile setup interface, a bunch of microphones, which I can take a lot of places, but that's sort of downsized over the years.
Sure.
Yeah.
Has that been a part of the label? Like, have you recorded records or done like EPs or demos or live stuff?
Particularly in the beginning, a lot of so the record label kind of started as because I was recording and producing my own music. So through that, and in college, I started producing mates. And then they needed a home or needed help putting it out. So I knew how to do it, and so just lended that hand. So I think a lot of the earlier releases tended to be stuff that I'd had quite a heavy hand on.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, not so much in the last few years. I think the last one that I really had any sort of hand in that world was just in terms of mastering was a couple of years ago. But that's kind of all I've really done in that sense for a fair
And so
time.
it was just for your own music at first, and then your friends' music. Would you would you make the recording or the mastering a recoupable expense, or was it just all kind of like part of the deal?
So I would just, if I was doing it as a record label as such, I would not charge at all, and it would just be something that I sort of consider a recoupable cost, as you say.
Okay.
But I would do it for a lot of different people. So it wasn't just people that I was interested in releasing and stuff like that. So I would I would have like hourly rates or day rates and stuff like that.
Yeah.
On those kinds of projects, but more often than not, ended up being a recoupable cost.
Okay, that's kind of cool. So it's like a little bit of a revenue stream.
Yeah, exactly.
For the label, yeah. So you don't do much of it anymore.
No, not particularly, and very, very rare, just because of time and effort that goes into that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and I guess I guess the hope is that you get to a point where you're recouping or you're selling enough records to be able to pay someone to do it. That hopefully, I'm not speaking to your abilities as an engineer at all, but hopefully elevates the quality, right? I mean, the goal is to hire producers and recording studios and engineers all over the world, kind of thing.
Oh yeah, of course. And I think the nice thing about particularly the sort of family that like I'd say I've formed over the years, a lot of the people end up going to the same producer, and like we haven't actually sent anyone to a producer as such. We're not that kind of label just yet. So like, but a lot of the people end up coming from the same producers or have that similar sound in a sense.
Okay. Well, that kind of brings me to my next question, because this is what I was reading on your website. And I always find it interesting when a label represents a lot of different genres. I find it would make things hard for me to present myself as a curator with such an array of genres. So how do you make it work? Having pop music and experimental music, how do you have this, array of genres? How do you make that work under the same umbrella?
I think it's definitely in terms of our audience having an understanding of me as a curator, or like Beth Shalom Records as a curator, because ultimately, like, I started the label merely to make myself look more professional as a musician. Like, it wasn't ever a consideration of it being anything more than that. And it's just eventually grown into just putting out music that I really love and enjoy, and enjoying a wide range of music is sort of it. The record label encapsulates that in a good way for me. So in terms of getting people on board with us being a genre fluid, that's the term that I use, a genre fluid record label. I think it's looking at like all these different genres that we work with, and like there's always links, in my opinion. So whether it's a lot of the stuff that we have done over the years tends to be within the sort of punk, emo sort of area. And so, but off that, you can go to like scrams and into hardcore, or you could go from hardcore into metal. You could go onto like from emo to emo rap and stuff like that. So
there's always a line that connects back to something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And like, I think that's, I mean, a lot of people might listen to all the stuff that we put out and think like, where's that line? But for me, it's very clear as a curator. And I think we've got to a point where people trust us, and like, it's nice keeping people on their toes as well. I think like for me, like following record labels over the years, you get a lot of labels who they just put out the same kind of music, and that's great. They have their niche and stuff like that. But as a listener, I like to be excited about different things. So being kept on my toes is something that I want to also have for the people who follow us as a record label.
I'm obsessed with this question because I don't know what the right answer is, and you know, whether you have a label that is like has a completely unified sound, or at least a completely unified aesthetic, to the point where you could blindly buy any record, and if you had liked one record, you'll like any number of the records, as opposed to a completely eclectic roster and genres all over. I love what you're talking about, of having these kind of 2 or 3 or 4 degree separation, but some sort of connection. But the funny thing is that after doing this show for 3 or 4 years, you realize that like there are labels who are doing what you're doing and are doing it in an eclectic way, but connected. Then you're seeing labels that are doing it completely eclectic and disconnected, and then labels who have a cohesive sound, and they're all successful. Like there is no there is no like common. I'm not seeing any sort of like, oh, these labels tend to be more successful. It just like it almost like it has no impact on the label's success. That's what I've noticed.
No, definitely. And I think it depends on the audience that you form from it as well. Like I think there are a lot of Erased Tapes, if you know them, is a label that I follow.
Yes.
They're one of my, like, I don't like using the word idol, but in terms of like, they're a label that I look up to quite a lot. And even though a lot of the music that we release is far from what they do in terms of how eclectic they are, but how cohesive they are as well. Like, that's kind of the point that I want to get to.
That's one of the few labels that when they put something out or announce something, I'll stop what I'm doing and go listen, just because I know that there's a good chance that I'm going to love it.
Yeah, it's exactly that.
Erased Tapes, if you're listening, check your email. I emailed you many months ago. I don't know if you have a contact, and please let me know. But I love that label as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is so interesting. And I wonder, tell me what you think about this, because I wonder if label owners overestimate their influence on the fans. I wonder, do fans even think about what we're talking about? Do they think about, oh, I like this label because they put out all this great music? Or do they just come to that label because they like one artist? Like, do we even know how many of our fans like multiple of artists of ours? I kind of wonder that if maybe we as labels are just overthinking it or overestimating our influence.
I think it can be quite easy to gauge whether that's based on sales, streams,
True.
like who you see like interacting and engaging with stuff on social media. And like for us, like we run a lot of shows, and like last year in November we celebrated our 7th birthday with like our first sort of little festival. And so like we had 14 bands play that day, but we had everything from just sort of dream pop kind of stuff all the way through to hardcore, like chaotic hardcore, mathcore kind of stuff. And every band was like very different, but everyone enjoyed everyone kind of thing. And like it was quite a beautiful thing to see, like the fact that we formed a community which people trust in terms of like what we release, but also like it goes back to like them trusting us as a curator as well.
And I think that, and you're right, and I think that can be measured certainly on a local scale because you see people in person.
Yeah, that's it.
What do artists like about working with your label? Do you have any idea?
I think one of the nice things about us is we're like, with the UK and the sort of like scenes that we've sort of grown up as a label in, everyone is like, it's all one scene basically, whether you're playing emo, whether you're playing hardcore, whether you're playing math rock, they all merge, which links back to that sort of like 3 or 4 degrees of separation that we touched upon. So I think like we've been sort of a very familiar label to a lot of people over the years, and like familiar in a way that like we are a family to the bands that we work with, and like they're all and like an extended family of each other as well. So, and through doing shows, that sort of like solidifies it further. And because we do shows, we do obviously all the label services, whether it's distribution, PR, stuff like that, and all the way through to like the talent agency that I run that is linked to the label as well. So there's a lot of different things that we're able to offer and able to work to develop these artists on, because ultimately not a lot of them are huge. Like some of them we've taken to Radio 1 and done like live sessions and stuff like that. Others, they're still playing like 50 capacity venues but packing them out and stuff like that. So yeah, we have a lot that we can do to help develop the smaller artists, but nurture the ones which are larger also. And I think the family,
And that's what is community a big part of that? Like, do artists enjoy the community of other artists on your label?
Oh yeah, definitely. Like there's even if they've gone on tour with each other a couple of months earlier, there still be like pestering me to get on each other's shows, even though like even though like from an industry point of view that might not make the most sense because you've just sold that same bill 2 or 3 months beforehand, but they still want to be around each other even if for those few hours at the show.
Yeah, right.
So like, but you might then get that band come along as punters because they still want to be there.
Sure.
So yeah, there's a really nice community aspect to our label and how we operate. And yeah, I think over the last few years, particularly, that's just solidified.
We've been discussing lately this topic of how labels can convince artists to sign with them, particularly when a label is new or doesn't have a lot of accolades and maybe struggles with feeling like an imposter. How does a new label, in your opinion, approach bands and what do they offer them?
I think you've really got to think about what you can offer, because ultimately if you're going to go to a band who is at the point where they're pressing vinyl, they need a larger PR company, but you're still doing tape releases, you don't really have any infrastructure to pay out for someone to be your press agent or anything like that. You've really got to, I think having some perspective is really important. But at the same time, like that band that you might be able to put a couple of grand into to actually do that release properly and that be your first sort of like big release, that might be the thing which changes everything and how that label operates. So I think there's two sides to the coin, if that makes sense. I think definitely knowing what you're able to offer without overstretching yourself, but also pushing yourself to a degree that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That's something we've just been kind of thinking about a lot. And I think it doesn't take long for a label, especially if there is that community component built in, that it doesn't take long for a label to be able to get a little bit of experience enough to say, hey, at least, come alongside and release a single together or an EP digitally and to start that relationship.
Yeah, that's that. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah, so I think you're on to, you just said your 7th birthday in November.
Yes.
Assuming you're talking about the label and not yourself, but.
Oh no, that's, yeah.
Okay. Otherwise I'm going to need your parents' permission to air this, but how did your label come? So let's go back to 2014. How did your label come to be?
So I'd been gigging for about 2 or 3 years by that point as a solo artist. Just sort of like on the local scene, like probably not going like further than London and stuff like that. And even then it wasn't it wasn't big gigs in London or anything like that. But I was studying a lot in college about sort of marketing yourself, pitching to labels and stuff like that. And I'd got really fascinated with this idea of pitching myself to a label and finding a home which I could grow in, essentially. But at that point, I was already distributing myself. I'd already had like some press contacts that I'd sort of built over the years. And I was just consulting one of my lecturers at the time, and I just said, I'm thinking of doing this. Any help or any ideas of how best to pitch myself? And they just turned around and said, well, you're your own label already. Why do you need someone at this stage?
Yeah.
And yeah, so it goes back to what I was saying about, creating it to make myself look more professional. I announced that I signed to Beth Shalom Records. I didn't necessarily say, I'm forming a record label. I made all the accounts and everything like that and said that I'd signed to a record label. And it sort of went from there.
Wait, were you being like, sorry to interrupt you. Were you being
that's right.
Were you being disingenuous, like to your fans? Like, did you actually pretend that like this wasn't your own label?
Oh no, I didn't pretend in any way, but okay. It's just like, it
I wouldn't judge you if you did.
No, definitely. Like, There's a lot of people who do that, but no, I wasn't like that. I was saying, oh, this is a label that I formed, like, but I had said that I'd signed to Beth Shalom Records as such. So yeah, I wasn't pulling the wool over their eyes or anything like that.
I would totally do that. Okay, sorry, continue with the story.
And yeah, so it's kind of just carried on from like there, as I mentioned, like producing friends in college, and then joining like Facebook forums for like UK emo and grunge and stuff like that, and like getting to know a few bands in that scene. And sort of just over the years, like particularly early on, we were doing a lot of smaller cassette releases. That was our very, like, aside from the sort of handmade CDs I was making to take on tour with me, all our early physical releases from other bands were all cassettes. And so I think within the space of about 18 months, we did about 14 cassette runs. And so by that point, that's when we invested in our first vinyl run alongside, I think, 4 other record labels around the world. And so by doing those smaller projects, we kind of grown and grown.
Sorry, you did a compilation?
No, so like a co-release as such. So
okay.
Within the punk scene in particular, it's a really fun thing, and it's something that I would love to do a lot more. But it's when you get to a certain level, it doesn't necessarily make sense. But a lot of labels, if they want to like put out a release for a band, they might pitch it to a load of labels that they're friends with, and press like 500 copies, but each label takes like 50 copies or something like that, and so they'll sell it in their particular region or something like that.
I see. Sorry, I want to camp on this for a second. So
yeah,
these are this is one release. This is one artist, one album.
So one album. Yep.
And you're obviously like relatively splitting the expenses 4 ways.
Yeah, so splitting it directly 4 ways, covering the band's costs and everything.
Very cool.
Yeah.
And then you are then splitting the label share? Would the label get more than normal because there's 4 labels?
So what in terms of
royalties?
Quantity of royalties? No,
yes.
it would just continue to be the same deal that like we would operate on now.
Okay.
So
if it was 50-50, then the 4 labels would share 50%?
Exactly. Similar to that.
Okay. And then where were these labels located that they're kind of regions where there wouldn't necessarily be overlap of audiences?
So we had one, so me being in sort of like the south of England, we did have another smaller one, which was more of a bedroom style distro, which they did a lot of stuff around record stores in the south of England as well. So they had like different streams that they could put it through. Then we had one in the US and then one in Germany as well.
Oh, that's great. Okay, so just one American, one North American. That's very cool.
Yeah.
And then you would ship, so then you would ship like their share of the records.
Exactly,
that's very cool.
It's a very common thing within the punk scene. It's like, it's really cool. And like I've got so many records where you look on the back and it's like 8 record labels are involved.
Yeah. And so it was a good experience?
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And like, I've definitely, like the American label I've actually collaborated with about 8 times since.
Okay.
So like that's a relationship which has like been really beneficial over the years.
Yeah. No, I bet. And I mean, how you must have to almost like throttle your workload with that record because you're only getting like a fourth, of what you would normally get. Is that true? Like, do you feel like you had to kind of just only put in a certain amount? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, for me, I was kind of the core label as such, so I was kind of coordinating everything.
Yeah.
So for me, it was quite helpful to sort of gauge how a larger release would work because I was sort of the main driving force around everything. I was doing a lot of the press for that as well. So while I had people collaborating on the vinyl and stuff like that, I was doing a lot of the press myself.
I feel like it's the kind of thing that would do better the more records you did with that same group of people, just because you've all of that initiation works itself out on the first release, the second release could almost hit the ground running.
Yeah, it works smoother and smoother each time you go.
I've always dreamed about doing that, what you're talking about, but not necessarily labels in different regions, but labels with different expertise. Like if there's a label that has physical distribution, there's a label that maybe is a tape label, and so we just do the tape with them. And then maybe there's a label who is like more of a streaming label, or more of a digital label who has good access to playlists, and maybe we let them take care of the digital, almost like splitting it up by 3 or something. I feel like And if there's like a label who has a massive Bandcamp following, then it's like we just do the downloads with this team. You know what I mean? That's kind of been a dream of mine.
Yeah, that's quite an interesting concept actually, because like I've done a lot of releases where I might do the vinyl and the digital, and then I might have another record label doing the tapes or the CD. Particularly like if I'm working with a Japanese label, CDs sell a lot better over there than vinyl does. So like splitting it like that works quite well, and like playing to each other's strengths as well is always handy. Yeah.
So talk to me, we're going back to your label now and talking about, I had read something about you guys have a DIY collective. Is that right? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the DIY collective, is that Let's Stop Hanging Out you're referring to?
Yes.
Yeah, so that formed in 2018 with a number of record labels, a sync agency, and a PR company, and we essentially all teamed up it was mostly to do shows in the beginning, but then like the record labels, the bands on those record labels would also get like discounted rates when it came to PR. With the PR agency and sync agency would get a better cut, etc., etc.
Okay.
So it kind of like there were a number of reasons why that started, but for whatever reason that sort of died down to the point where it was just shows. And so I was the main driving force behind that in the end. And since then I've sort of rebranded that all with the same name and everything, but that has become essentially the live arm and the agency arm of Beth Shalom Records.
Mm-hmm.
So I run that as a talent agency where I have a few acts that I manage and a roster of live acts as well that I work with.
And I imagine some of those acts are non-roster. They're not officially on the label, or are they all?
Yeah, so I have like, it's probably split quite evenly, half and half. Or they might be bands that I've previously released but might have gone onto a larger label, so I already have that working relationship with them. I'm just working in a different capacity.
Yeah, okay, that's cool. And did you say, are you offering label services? Do you do that to non-roster people?
So I do that through Let's Stop Hanging Out. So I mostly have done that for my management acts and stuff like that, but over since I started that, I've had discussions with bands about doing that for label services, particularly PR. I've done a few campaigns with that. So because I have that infrastructure of Beth Shalom Records, I'm able to move that over quite smoothly.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to ask you, like, what's the motivation for doing the agency and the management and the label services? Is it strictly financial? Is it just that you're maximizing, the infrastructure you already have? Like, what is the motivation behind that?
I think it's a mixture, really, because for me, like, I've done like booking work for a number of years for like a lot of bands, whether that was directly through the label, through a previous agency that I worked for. And it just made sense that like when I was rebranding last year that I kind of took everything under that. So in terms of like the booking agency side of it and the management side of it, there was a lot that I was doing out of Beth Shalom Records that I could easily move within our infrastructure.
Right.
And then in terms of label services and PR in particular, like that's something I've been doing for years. I'm well versed in it. People trust me, they're aware of my knowledge, so they're more than happy to come to me on that. So yeah, I think like in some way it was a financial like reasoning, because obviously the more stuff that I do, like eventually, because this isn't a full-time job for me, it's not even part of my job. Like ultimately, like I'm just starting to build more and more revenue for myself and my family. So yeah, but also the fact that growing Let's Stop Hanging Out and building this extra roster of bands allows a wider audience to eventually know Beth Shalom Records and Beth Shalom Records acts as well.
Yes. Yeah. Well, no, that's true. Yeah, absolutely. That's true. And so how do you balance the two? I mean, running a label full-time is a handful. Running a label when you have a part-time job is a handful. So how do you, running an agency plus running a label?
I think I've got quite a good balance of the two, because a lot of the bands, like half the bands on Let's Stop Hanging Out, are already part of the label. They're already discussions that I'm having. Whereas like the bands which I'm managing or stuff like that, like I've got a band which is signed to Prosthetic Records and stuff like that. So that's obviously a bit of a larger commitment, but
Sure.
That's quite a well-oiled machine by this point, because I managed the previous band members' band and stuff like that. So we're very familiar in how we operate. So in terms of my time split, it's quite equal. And fortunately, I've got my wife Esty and George, who is actually part of one of my management bands, who assist me on the record label, sort of like as assistants or consultants and stuff like that. So it's not just me working on the label, whereas on the talent agency side, it is just me.
Right. Well, that's good. That's nice that you have help.
Yeah.
Let's talk about your commitment to becoming carbon neutral. This is really exciting, really super interesting. And honestly, I don't know, I might just be ignorant, but I'm not sure if I've heard of any other labels who are doing this, at least on an official scale. Can you tell me what the impetus for that was and how it works?
So I think that's a tricky question. So for me, like when the pandemic hit, like I was trying to come up with ways to, like, I feel like the label, or at least for me, I was stuck in a rut, and maybe that was just me mentally, like being stuck at home on furlough or something like that. But I needed something more to happen. And yeah, so with shows and everything taken away, and that sort of like live side of everything taken away, I needed another focus. And so going in deep into sort of the sustainability side of things, and my wife is really hot on this kind of stuff, so she was able to help quite a lot on putting a lot of this into place, and she's very knowledgeable in this front as well. So for me, like just seeing how the planet is changing, and particularly like the impact of production of like resources or stock can have on this planet, like was quite alarming. And like learning more about sort of the process of putting together releases, and like all the different components that might go into like a vinyl record or a CD, stuff like that. So looking at like plastic, single-use plastic in particular, and also like waste within warehousing as well.
Sure.
So that's just on like the sustainability front, which obviously we can get to. But in terms of the carbon offsetting, it's something that I've seen like the odd band do here and there. But like it's always difficult to know and to trust what people are saying. So fortunately, I'd already had a friend who worked quite closely with a company called NMT, which is the Nemo Macadamia Trust. And they essentially plant macadamia trees in Malawi, and in turn like support the smallhold farmers, create income and create jobs within Malawi, which isn't just like carbon offsetting, planting a tree like so many people say they do. It's making that like contribution to a community a family and creating income for people who might not otherwise have it. So like that was a lot of things which it was really important for me to do, and like it was something that we were considering to do as like a couple, let alone as a label.
Sure.
So, and then in terms like, so yeah, we offset with them. We do it on a monthly basis. So our Bandcamp subscription service, like there's not many people on it, but like the amount of money that we get from that works out roughly to the like metric ton that we would need to offset.
Okay.
So the more people that are subscribing, the more that we can offset and become, is it carbon negative? I'm trying to think of the correct term. I'm really bad with like the actual terms in my head, but
so did you have to figure out how much a record, like selling a record or a CD or a tape, like how you would offset that? Is that what you tried to figure out?
Yeah, so we did that to like the closest degree based on like the average that we tend to send out, and like using carbon neutral couriers as well. Like we didn't have to consider that and stuff like that.
Okay.
But in terms of like sending a bunch of records via Royal Mail or something like that, or overseas, like the really useful thing is with the company that we offset through is you're able to look at how much like a domestic flight might cost or something like that. So you're able to roughly estimate how much it might cost for something to get over to Germany, over to America and stuff like that. And so being able to average that out across the board, like, and make this sort of monthly commitment to it, has been really useful for us.
Let me ask you a kind of a direct question. If a record label were to make $1,000 in revenue, or even $100 for easy math, what amount or what percentage would be required to donate to offset approximately?
I think it is very tricky to say, is because it's based on like it's very tricky to say because it's like it depends on how many units have you sold within that or stuff like that.
Right. Okay.
Like,
okay.
Is because there's a lot of like aspects to consider, like the weight of things, how much that might cost in terms of like where you're shipping it and stuff like that.
Is it mostly just about shipping, or I mean, what about the manufacturing process, or even
shipping, production?
Yeah,
so you can
yeah.
like a lot of the suppliers that we now use, like we've researched and spoken to quite closely in terms of like how they like dispose of their waste and stuff like that. Couriers that they use, like one of the pressing plants, we requested that they started using a specific courier because we wanted to use a carbon neutral courier to get over to the UK and stuff like that. And so it took us about 6 months of like working on everything before we actually even announced that we were making this commitment. So while I was on furlough and stuff like that, that was quite a large chunk of my time.
That's pretty cool. I mean, I can imagine that the fans would respond to that well, knowing that you're taking care of. I mean, ultimately, you're basically like kind of like taking care of their environmental responsibility as well, because they can make a purchase from you, and then trust that you're reconciling that purchase on their behalf. Is that true?
Yeah, in a larger way, I guess. And like, with one of the things that we said quite explicitly to bands before we announced this is that like any products that we make, that you make, we expect you to be in line with this.
Okay.
So like even down to t-shirts and stuff like that.
Yeah.
We only use sustainable and ethically sourced clothing as well. So like asking bands if they ever make their own merch. Not that a lot of them do now, fortunately, but asking bands if they are to make their own merch that they also use sustainable materials too.
Oh, that's very cool. Yeah, no, that's very cool. Was you said it took a months and was it a tough process to do to say, okay, we are a carbon neutral record label?
I think like we were probably ready to say that a lot sooner. It's just maybe it's just the imposter in me that wanted to wait.
Right. Yeah, right.
Because like I think you always worry that someone's going to turn around and like, oh no, that's complete nonsense. You're greenwashing or anything like that. Particularly on that side of thing, like it's such a hot topic right now, which is why we try to be very transparent about the exact like offsetting partner that we work with, exactly what t-shirts we're doing, exactly how our vinyl is kinder to the planet in terms of like the pressing plants and how they dispose of their waste, the eco mix vinyl and stuff that we use. Are we using single-use plastics? No. So like trying to be as transparent as possible with every aspect of what we do before we actually announced it was something that we felt was really important, so that no one could turn around and say, no, that's not right.
Well, that's really wise. I would probably be the same way. Was the research that you did and this whole process, would this apply to labels in other parts of the world as well, in America? What advice would you give for a label who says, okay, I want to do something similar?
I think it's like, it depends what aspect of your label you want to make sustainable. If you want to make your record label carbon neutral or anything like that, you can just go onto our Instagram or something like that, or find NMT, Nemo Macadamia Trust online, and go through them. They're wonderful people. They do amazing things. But if you want to look more about your suppliers, or even just the merch that your bands are touring with, like there's a lot of information out there. And like one of the things that took us quite a while was like, particularly when it came to the merch, it's like, we want people to have a quality product, but we want it to be organic, ethically sourced. And so like there were a lot of things in that we had to think about. It wasn't just like, oh, we need it to be sustainable. We also want it to be comfortable. Like,
right. Yeah.
So trying different things as well was a process. Yeah.
What kind of research did you do on the impact of digital and streaming? I understand that streaming comes with a lot of carbon impacts as well, environmental impacts. Was there any research that came up when it comes to Bandcamp downloads or your catalog streaming on DSPs and how to offset that?
So that's something that I really want to look at in the future, and like I think it's very difficult for that ever to change. Like particularly from a label point of view, we can't turn around and tell Spotify where their servers have to be based, or anything like that.
Yeah.
But in terms of trying to and I believe there are greener streaming platforms being developed because it is an ongoing issue. But like in terms of our operations as a record label, like that's where we know that we're sustainable, carbon neutral. But onwards from that, all we can do is shout and like hope that things can change in the future.
Yeah, right.
So streaming is, and like servers and stuff like that, is always one of these things which on a local level it's going to be difficult to gauge. But I'm hoping like people wake up to it.
Well, and I mean, yeah, and you're right. You can't really tell Spotify what to do, and hopefully they're something that other people will hold them accountable to, or the general public will hold them accountable to.
Yeah.
I think it's really cool. I think it is really cool, and I commend you on it. And it sounds daunting. Is it something that you're grateful that you did that you put the work into? I mean, there's people listening to this right now who are thinking, I think we should do this. What kind of effort are people looking at if they wanted to pursue this?
I think like it will be a lot. It is a lot of effort. And like, but the reward is tenfold. I think if you're willing to do it, do it. And like, there's certain things that for 2022 as a record label, we want to create resources to help others do it, because it's all well and good us doing it and being a record label, or like, I think we were the first in the UK to at least shout about it publicly. But like, it's all well and good that being the case, but ultimately it's not just us in the music industry. So we're hoping to create resources to assist and help people do the same, and potentially doing consultancy down the line, and like helping smaller record labels who want to make that jump and want to make that commitment do it too.
Yeah, no, that's very cool, and we should talk about that, because I think there are people in our audience would, at the very least, whether it's diving in, to be able to say we are 100% carbon neutral, which, like you said, opens yourself up to a bit of skepticism and criticism. But and so that might not necessarily be everyone's first step, but maybe neutralizing some of the stuff that you do, it would be a good start.
Yeah.
So yeah, we should look at some ways that we can kind of work with our community to help them do that.
Definitely.
I'm curious. I will wrap up soon. What kind of challenges do you encounter on an occasional basis? I'm not talking about the environmental aspects anymore, but I know that you've been at this, running a label, for a long time, and you're on the management side of things, and you're on the PR side of things. You're an artist yourself. What's the hardest part about running a record label?
I think the hardest part is currently oversaturation.
Yes.
And like, I love how active the music industry is. But yeah, cutting through, I think, is one of the hardest things to do at the moment. And like, even with our like audience, like we have a really supportive audience, but finding those new audiences through all the noise, and like being strategic about like releases, when we're going to do it, based around when other artists or albums are coming out, it gets tricky. Like, I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah.
And like, and I think that's why for us, like, the genre fluid thing is really, really useful, because it's like a couple of weeks ago we released a single from an artist called Bleak Soul, who they used to be in a band called As It Is, who were on a much larger label, but then like, so they're sort of like a mixture of Elliott Smith, Placebo, but with this sort of pop punk inspiration. But then in a couple of weeks' time, we're going to be releasing a like noise rap artist that sounds like Death Grips kind of stuff. So it's like, I think particularly for our audience and cutting through, having that sort of like sudden juxtaposition in terms of what we release is really useful. But yeah, finding that new audience and cutting through is always tough, and it will only get harder. So yeah, finding new ways to get to people, is something I want to look at.
Yeah, it's that is probably, I think a lot of people would say that's probably their number one issue. I've asked this before of our community, but what is considered a win for your label? I mean, what needs to happen for you to say, okay, that was a good day?
I think like it could be as small as like a development artist getting 1,000 plays on Spotify, like sometimes, or it could be like us selling out of like a vinyl variant or a piece of merch or something like that. And like, for us, physical media is like quite a big thing. And like, we've always tried to concentrate more on that than the digital. Maybe that's our downfall, I don't know. But yeah, it's like just small things, or it might be a gig that we're running or something like that has sold out. Yeah, it could be a whole number of things, given like how stretched over a lot of aspects of the music industry we are at the moment.
Do you ever stop and recognize your wins? Like, do you ever, like, I fail to do that myself, and I take so many things for granted. But do you ever pause?
Rarely.
Yeah.
I'm always really bad. Like I was talking in my sleep once, and I'd been booking a tour like the previous day, and like turns out I offered my wife the support slot for the whole tour that I'd been booking that day. So it's like I think that's just testament to like my like I don't pause very often. I'm always moving in that sense.
Pillow talk. That's and I think I'm starting to get a little bit better at it, because what I do is at night, like if I'm kind of like just about to feel like a little bit down, or just about to feel a little bit like, what am I doing? I quickly interrupt that thought with saying, oh, by the way, like this one thing happened today, and this thing alone would probably have blown my socks off 10 years ago. But it's so small. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's like something I've seen before, I've done before, that I don't let it doesn't affect me, but I almost need to stop and make sure it affects me.
Yeah, because I think, like, as you said, sort of 10 years ago or whatever, like, for me, like 5 years ago, one of my bands getting offered a really cool support slot, that would have made my week. Yeah. Whereas, like, at the moment, booking shows for people, I'm probably getting some of my band's, like, support slots every single day. So it's like, it's one of those things where it just happens so often you don't get as excited. Yeah. But it's still really cool.
Totally.
But I think I've got better at recognizing when things are going well since like I've been managing bands. Like I think because you see the impact that has directly, like aside from the label point of view, like you see that the impact of that like on a greater scale, I feel, when you are managing bands. So that's helped me a lot in terms of taking that step back and seeing what we accomplish.
Well, no, that's really smart. And we are jaded and we have moved our own goalposts, but we forget that hasn't necessarily happened to our artists, or especially to our younger artists. Yeah. And so when I mention in passing to an artist that we've got a premiere, or that so-and-so is going to write about it, they're kind of like, what? And like freaking out. And I'm like, oh, yeah, I forgot that's probably a big thing for you. That's your first. That's like my 50th, but it's your first. We forget that. That's so funny. You know what, Joe, this has been so fun to chat with you. Thank you so much for doing this. I'm sorry it's taken so many years for us to get together.
No worries at all. It's been a lot of fun.
Your label is great. And you guys have such I love what you do with merch and what you do with vinyl. I feel like that must be, with totes and shirts and everything and these deluxe packages you put together. I feel like you must have recognized that your fans really like that, or that's a special thing for you guys.
I think like for me as a music listener, I've always enjoyed more than just the music. Yeah, I like imagery when it comes to music as well. So being able to put together these like deluxe packages, as you say, where you might have a zine or some prints alongside a t-shirt and a tote, I'd probably, if I had endless amounts of money, I would probably do that every time I see one of my favorite bands release something, rather than just buying the record. So yeah, I feel like that's always really important. And also like, just like being able to support bands in like a further way than just putting out music is always important too.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for doing this. I have a couple of, if you have a little bit more time for our patrons.
Yeah, absolutely fine.
Thanks so much for listening. Go to BethShalomRecords.com. That's spelled BethShalom Records.com. And you can learn more about the record label, and you can reach out and follow them on social media and reach out to Joe if you have more questions about what it means to be a carbon neutral record label. Thank you so much for listening. As always, here's something I want to remind you about our record label business plan that some folks have been grabbing. You can go and get that at all of our resources that are free. And I know that people have found helpful. Go to otherrecordlabels.com. You can get our business plan there, as well as our toolkit and all the other cool stuff that might help you out with your label. If you have been a long-time listener, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts. That's kind of a sweet thing to do. If you picked up the book, you can go to Amazon and leave a review there. That's also very nice. And now you can do star ratings on Spotify, so that's something you could do as well. This would always help us out. And if you want to get even more intimate, if you want to really get deep and connected, then you can join our Patreon, where you get Patreon. I hate it. It's called like Patreon is the thing and patrons are the people. But anyway, you can join our Patreon and get access to our bonus episodes, including my extended interview with Beth Shalom, and over 25 now bonus episodes on our Patreon. Go to patreon.com/otherrecordlabels.